Hello. So today we're going to talk about request and response API. So when you're asking something towards the API, he has to respond, that architecture. And we are specifically going to use the rules of REST. And simply put, because it is simple to use, and you will see it a lot out there, like a lot of web application using this REST concept. And we are going to use the common language of JSON instead of XML or YAML, because JSON is really easy to use, especially when you're in JavaScript economy. So it's really easy to use for that case. So what we are going to talk about today will be some REST concept, an overview, not detailed enough, but just an overview so you could understand some points of it, right? An endpoint example, and some implementation in Node.js. So, some concept would be usually, generally, when you have a request response, you always have either get or post, either get or post method. So you'll be having that, either this or that. But in REST, they mentioned get and post is not enough to showcase and to make other people understand the endpoints for the API to work. So they separated them into how many? Five, yeah, five types of requests. So I had to count here. Apologies. So get, which is just getting the data. It could be a collection of data or one entity, just one part of the collection. Post, which creates a new entity of that specific data. Put, which is replacing. Instead of saying update, you could say replace. So instead, it will replace the data that you have created into a new one, whatever you want. So this endpoint exists. You don't have to use it, but this exists. So put for replacing the data. Then delete, which removes the data, as you could see, like it removes the data that you want to delete. And patch would be updating. So what is the difference between the patch and put? I will showcase that example a bit later. So this is the patch and put. So patch will update one part of the entity of that specific data, an attribute, for example, a name, it will update that. While this one will replace the whole entity. So these are the types of methods in the REST concept. So an example of REST endpoint, for example, is a user. So a user entity of an API. So for the get methods, we'll be usually having endpoint of users, which is a collection of user returns you as a response. It will return you a list of users. And in the get method, for another case, is getting one entity of that user collection. For post, it will look like this, so there is no change here. Just the body tag. So inside, usually in the post, for a normal request response, you put the data in the body. So put, which we are dealing with one entity of a collection, we have to give the parameter of the ID of the user. So it will specifically deal with one ID, and that specific user, you're replacing their properties. And in delete, so yeah, again similar. So we are deleting one thing, so to give the ID of that entity. In patch, similar to that, so you're giving that entity endpoint the attribute that you want to change for that, not replacing it, but just updating one attribute or one property of it. So you could see, actually, yeah, this node is saying endpoints are usually noun. So REST, usually you have a noun. So if this is users, so it will be called users. If you have a REST collection, so you will be having like article collections on article, so you'll be having articles. So so an article endpoint, and if you want to have one article, so you just mention articles and the ID of it. usually you'll see it as a noun instead of a verb. So a verb is for a different case like RPC or gRPC, a request and response API. But for this case, REST usually uses a noun, and this is enough for people to understand. It's easy to understand. So just define a noun endpoint. So for the implementation, this is us. So we could use a front-end API, a front-end that is calling our API, or a postman. So postman, the API that you could call to the project. So this is us. We're calling our project, so the nodejs, using the REST, like the REST rules. So we're requesting something or we are saying something, and then the backend will respond. And in the nodejs, so you could think of this one as well like request and response between the MongoDB database and the Node.js. It is requesting something or telling to the MongoDB to do something, and MongoDB will respond something. And as you notice, the name Node.js container MongoDB container, so we're dealing with Docker here. So for this case, we are going to use Docker, but you could run it as well if you have Node.js installed and MongoDB installed. And I think I wrote some README to run the project in that case, whether it's Docker or npm. Yes. So let's see the code. The structure, I've started here. It's a structure here. So we have a server. That's where this project is running. So a bootstrap, and it will connect with the MongoDB, and the server will listen to it. Server listen on port 3300, right? So that's the and we have a app.js folder file that registers all the endpoints. For this case, we have a user endpoint. So in this one, in Express, when you want to have an endpoint as mentioned in REST, right? You could register it as this one. So this user router, and this file has all the endpoints that we have mentioned here. So let's go to the router. So that's what we are dealing here. So we want to care about more about the endpoints instead of the implementation of the other ones. Like, since that's why I abstracted it. So like the models, let's see the models a bit, and to understand what we are dealing with here. So we'll have a name, an email, which is a type of string, a password. So this is the normal document type for the MongoDB. So we are telling this is the structure for our user that will be stored in the database. So name, email, and password. So let's go to the route. So in the router, in Express, it gives us a router. So it allows us to have a router. And this router will allow us to have the different RESTful endpoints that we want to use. A get method, a post method, a put method, and patch method, and delete method. So here what we will do here in the first one. So this slash, which in here we registered as users. So that's the root of the endpoint. So users. So what we want here is a list of users. So what do we do here? We have a callback. This callback has a request and response. So response is like responding towards the API, whoever is calling it. And request is coming from the user, right? So the user who is requesting something. So when we're requesting something, here we are not giving anything in the parameters or anything. So we don't use the request at all. We are just using the response. So what we want to do here is return something like a list of users. So I have made some functions in the services folder. So there is one called find many, which gives a list of users from the database. So we'll use rest.send, which is sending the response, and we will use find many. And we'll just call that function. That's the function, that's it. So that's about it for the list of users, nothing more, nothing special about it. So in the user router, we have this one. We want to give an ID. So the ID of user. So we are asking for the user to give us an ID, and we're returning an entity of that user, of the user collection. So how do we get it? So in Express, I think normally in any framework that is dealing with REST, you use the colon ID or colon whatever you name it, whatever you define it. But this defines it as that whatever you give in the, for example, this endpoint, like user slash 12, this number or this number or this number will be declared as a variable of ID. And how do we get that parameter? That the declared variable is using the request, because request is coming from the user, so we'll just use request. So let's declare a variable called ID here again. So we'll use request, and in the request we have parameters, so params. That's short for parameter. So we'll use parameter, and we have a variable called ID. So that's the ID that we are getting from the slash the endpoint. What are we going to do that with that? We are getting one user with that specific ID. There you have to do validation, throwing error if that doesn't exist, but for simplicity reason we won't do anything here. So we'll use rest.send, and we'll use find by ID, and that's it. So we respond with the user specifically. If it doesn't exist, it will give an empty object. Nothing, and not an empty entity. In the post, now we're going towards the post. So what does the post do? It creates a user. So as I mention every time, that post will always have a body. So we'll be using the body from the request. So what we'll do here, no validation again. So we'll use const user, and we will get the body from the request, and it will be a type of JSON, right? The common language will be a JSON. So we are expecting the user to give us a JSON body, and I'll showcase how that exactly looks like. So we'll say request.body, and the moment we receive the body from the user, we expect it to be name, email, and password. We create a user. So I made another function in the services called create user. So we'll use that one. So create user. And some people, like some case, there are some users or APIs, they want to give the user they want the thing that they have created. So for our case, we'll showcase to the user who is using the API that you have created this user and it looks like this. So we'll send that towards the user, whoever is calling this API. Now we are going towards the put. So in the put, as mentioned, it replaces all the attributes of the given ID. So we'll have users, for example, has a name of Khalid. Previously it was defined as name John, for example, and email John at, and pass will be like that, right? So pass. And in the put method, it will replace the whole thing into a new thing. So that's before and then after put. So now what it will replace is Johnny. Like I think it'll be better to say like dough, and you could say as well here it will change to dough and password to dough. So it will replace anything from here. So it will change to this, for example. Or when you put in the body nothing, like for example you didn't put password in it, it will remove the password as well. So when you don't put the entity or the attribute of password, for example, in the body of in the put method, it will replace that and mention, for example, that the password doesn't exist after that. So we could do validation, tell that you cannot do that, you cannot just empty it. But for our case, we just want to showcase how put works, right? So let's just use that. So we'll say user.route the put, and which function are we going to use? There is a method I have created. Again, it will be called, let me check, in the services, we have a function called set user by ID. Okay, so that's the function. So we'll call that function set user by ID. And what do we do here? We get the parameter. So we'll say const required parameter, and then we will do const. We don't really respond with the updated changes. So it will be set user by ID, and the ID is given this. right? So that's it. So it replaces everything. Oh yeah, set user. So that's the ID, and then we are giving the data that a user has put in the body. So in this one, we will use new user, edited user, and we will say request.body, and we'll put that in the second parameter. Patch. So what I mentioned is in this one, it will update partial. So if we mentioned that was before, now what we said is the password. We want to change the password to, for example, 12345 6. Now after patch, no, that's the body, and then after the patch, when you updated it in the database, it will look like this. So it will have the same attributes, but it will only replace or update that certain attribute that you have changed, like the password, for example. So if you add another one, you could update the whole thing, or you could specifically or individually update one part. Like, for example, I want to update the password, so you just mentioned the password itself in the body. So that will be patch. So let's use again here const id require implement const, and then we will say rest.send, and we will use a function called update user by id, and we will use the id, and here we will get our user. You could say user, I don't know, data. I think you could just say data. So request.body, and we'll call that data here. So that's updating and respond. Now in delete, nothing special about it, similar to get, but we'll just get the request.param, and here we'll just mention send.data, and then we have a function that deletes the user. So delete user by id, and we will call that delete user by id and give the id. So that's it. That's about the endpoints. Now let's run it in Postman. So usually I'll use docker compose up the build to run the whole project, the front end, like the database and the nodejs. So it has its own file. For example, nodejs has this, so it will start based on that. And let's see our API running. So say request API. It mentions node server.js server listening on port 333, MongoDB connected. So that means it is running. So let's call our Postman, and let's try to test each endpoint. So we have users, which means that it should be okay. We have several endpoints. So a brief introduction on Postman. So Postman is a way of calling your API. So it could be anything, any request response activity or event driven. So you could use it for testing purposes if you don't have any front end to test, right? So you could use this one. So we don't have it at the moment any user. So in the body, so that's the post. So we have a local 3300, and then it will be endpoint of users and then slash. So in the body, we have name, email, and password. So what it does is it will create a user based on name and email and password. So now when we send, receive nothing, unfortunately. Is there a problem? I checked a bit, and in the database we have created a password, so like name, email, and password, but we never received the response. And I think I know the reason. The issue was I forgot that you can't do it this way. So what we have to do is like find by ID won't result list of user or a user, but it will give a promise, and the API doesn't know how to deal with promises. So let's say async, it doesn't know how to deal with promises, so let's just use find by. So let's say user and call it, for example, find by ID, and we'll use async await here. So we use that, and we will replace everything here as well. So we have updated every endpoint. So I made a mistake, slight mistake basically. Instead of the previous one where we call the function put in rest.send, we call the functions first, put it declare it in a variable, so we wait until it is executed to the database, and then we put it there. So it just for every line, every method I have done that. So this one gets find many first, and then we'll put it in the rest.send. In line 13, it will do the same thing. So get function, this one, and here as well, and here as well, and here as well. So now let's test it again. So let's say endpoint of users, so a list of users. Yeah, for testing purposes, I have created one user, so in your case it will be empty. So when I say list of users, it will receive basically one part of it. I think, yeah, we have created one before. So we have created one, and this is it. Create another endpoint, so we'll say that's the get method, right? So we'll make another one. We'll say post, and this method it will be post. So in the body, you have parents headers body, and in the body there is different types. So we'll be using the raw, and in the raw we'll have it as a JSON. So in the JSON we'll say user, so it will be name, Johnny, and email. We have Johnny at, and in password, don't make a mistake on that. It will be password. Okay. So now let's run it. Let's test it out. It will post, and let's test it out. So it has created in the users. So it has created this. To test out, we could go again to the list of users and say get the users, and you notice that it gives me the new latest version. So another method which was the user with the ID. So the ID in this case will be this one. So the ID of this. So we'll use this. We'll take this ID and put it in the parameters. So let's say this, and we could call. I think no, just we don't need to have any of the params. So that's it. So we put it there, and let's say send, and it received the ID specified as Johnny. We could try it out with the user as well, the ID of that one, and let's mention this ID. So let's replace this and say get, and it'll give us that specific sort of ID. And so that's get. Post, we haven't tried the delete, so let's try the delete part. So when we go to another method, let's say delete, the endpoint will be this. So let's delete Khalid, for example. So let's use this, and there's nothing else needed. So when you delete, it deletes there. So let's try to check it out if it has deleted. So let's go to the get user, and let's fetch it, and we received only one. So that means that it has deleted. Now, what else are we going to try to use is put and patch. So let's first try with the patch. So how do the patch work? So let's go to the patch, another one endpoint. Let's use this, and let's say, oh yeah, we don't have this user anymore. We only have, where's the get method? So we only have this user, this type of user. So what we have to do here is let's change to patch and replace this ID. And in the body, we'll use raw, and say JSON, and we'll put JSON type. For example, we have Johnny, so let's call him Doe. So name, and we'll call him Doe. So let's use that. And oh, okay. It has changed it by verifying that. How could we verify it? If that's the mongoose, as a mongoose issue, it's a bug, and it's not a bug basically. Okay, but we get the list of users, and you could see that Doe has been changed. So what mongoose do is they give us the previous version. So when you fetch again, it will give you the latest version. Or another way is handling or changing something in the mongoose to always get us the latest version. But it's out of the scope for this case. So patch, you could see that it changes one variable. So what is it? So it will change one variable. So that's the variable. So we have changed though, and it has updated though. So now let's try with patch. So let's go use patch, use the ID of this. Oh no, we have already done patch. I'm sorry. So put, yeah, let's use put, and in the body, what we'll do is similar to them. So we will try to use name, and then we'll mention instead of saying Doe, we'll try to put it back to Johnny. So what will happen in this one? So when you do that, what happens is, again, because of the edited version, so again, we check it here. What happens? Do you notice that everything has been replaced and only the name has been given? That's the power of the put. So basically, when you put on a specific attribute, it will replace everything to this case. So let's put it back again because I want my stuff back. So let's put it back again, and let's say this. All right. So now let's check it again. So what do we have here? We have everything back. So put will always replace we'll always replace whatever we are giving in the body. So if we give only name, it will replace everything in the case of the document to the value that we have given in the body. But in patch, it only checks for a specified attribute. So for example, if we give a name, so it will replace the name. So if we give email, it will replace the email. So we'll add gmail.com, let's say, and let's replace that, update it. Let's check it here. So it's not here. Sorry. So we check it here. You see that gmail.com. So notice that I'm using always the get user. So you could even check in this part, right? So you could check the ID. So we check the changes from the get user. So use that, and you could see the changes here, right? So you will always see that this has been changed. So today we showcased the REST concept where we implemented the several methods that the REST is mentioning us to use. The get, where you could get a list of collections or one entity of the collection, a post for creating users, delete for deleting and one entity, put for replacing, and patch for updating. We have done it through nodejs container that had a certain boilerplate just to showcase the endpoint, and a MongoDB container. We never showed how the MongoDB container works, but you could view it as similar to the REST API here, that it uses an API to update or like request and respond. So you were able to see in Express that it gives a request coming from the user, and response is for the response of the requested user. So we could even reject for the request and tell them we don't have it, or we could validate it. So that's about it. And I think next video will be about event driven. So with REST, like the REST API that we have used, and we'll be adding WebSocket into it. Okay, that's about it. Thank you very much. Have a good day.